Hello, folks. Hi, Dolores. Hi, Kay. Hi, Deborah. Joe, I love you, but I've told you I can't with Joe Biden. You're wasting your breath and all of our time. Sorry, Deborah. Hi. But Kay says hi, Evelina. But Evelina says, bit extreme, love. Okay, folks, this is not in support of Joe Biden. Okay, but the infrastructure plan is here, and I think we all have to deal with it a bit because it's a reality. So I don't think we're wasting our time. But certainly Deborah's entitled to her opinion. So there we go. Hi, Dia Swift. Thank you for coming. And you're right, it's about policy, not Joe Biden. Lana says, share to Twitter. And I'm going to start with someone who I believe is close to Joe Biden. I don't really know anything about him, but he seems to be, well, you'll see his view, okay, in a minute. I think it's very interesting to see it and to see what he has to say. Anyway, the gentleman is Michael Likoski, and he sent out an email blast just yesterday, and I was on the receiving end of the email blast, and so I'm sharing what he sent. He said, "Hi all, so much going on the infrastructure front right now. I want to share my commentary piece. See below. Quote, President Joe Biden's vision. Your success is his success, unquote. In Bonfire this morning, it provides grounding for understanding the president's plan, shaping it, making it work for you, for us. Please do be in touch with thoughts for discussing, for engaging, for shaping, for positioning, for a post-passage." And it's signed by Michael. And it's dated April 6, 2021, and addressed to Bonfire. President Joe Biden's vision, your success is his success, by Michael Likoski, Partner, Advantage Infrastructure Advisors, whoever they are. Anyway, Michael Likoski says, last week in Pittsburgh, President Joe Biden delivered a seminal speech on infrastructure investment, introducing his American Jobs Plan. As someone who's conversant with Biden's long-standing leadership on infrastructure matters, much was familiar in terms of his distinctive public-private partnership investment strategy, okay, and assiduous concern for practicalities. That said, it was evolved, I think he's talking about the American Jobs Plan, decidedly presidentially commanding, mission-driven, and of the moment. Wow. The importance of the plan for finance, investment, and business decision-making is clear. There are certain ways to engage during the legislative process, as well as to position your governmental, private, or not-for-profit enterprise to benefit from the investment opportunity on its way. So this is advice to people to tie into those profits, tie into the plan to make those profits. And he goes on, Biden's speech and plan can be understood in 5 parts. First, the vision. For Biden, America is a land of possibilities where nothing is beyond our capacity if we work together. However, we simply cannot do so without organized infrastructure investments, which equip and resource us to work together, to build back better together, to be inventive together. It's about infrastructure. Simple paragraph. Well, that's the vision. The vision is there's nothing we can't do if we work together. Organized infrastructure investments which equip and resource us to work together. Second, the drivers behind the plan simply cannot compete globally, especially with China, without an infrastructure-driven, advanced manufacturing and inventive base. And compete we must. If America does not compete effectively and thus becomes overly dependent on other countries, we will jeopardize our national security. I have to say, I don't remember the Obama administration making such a statement. It's not a criticism. Okay. I'm glad someone is recognizing that we have to build things here. We have to make things here. We always did that. And now, to a lesser and lesser extent, we don't. And we really have to turn that around if we want to be successful as a nation. Going on with the piece, quote, this would result in allowing other countries to condition our ability as a people to realize America's possibilities. Now, I guess I have to say at this point, that's exactly what we've been doing to them. But I understand, okay, the desire not to have them do that to us. This is the thrust behind Biden posing the high-stakes question of the day concerning whether democracy will outcompete autocracy. I don't know if I would interpret it quite that way, more about whether this so-called democracy will outcompete their so-called autocracy. Because to be completely honest about that, I'm not sure they're that much worse an autocracy than we are. But anyway, Michael Lukowski goes on and says, again, it's about infrastructure. So democracy is about infrastructure. Well, I kind of think climate survival is about infrastructure. And maybe democracy is partly about infrastructure. But maybe infrastructure is partly about democracy as well. Anyway, He says, for the president, competing means attracting businesses, which requires high caliber airports, ports, water, communications, and other infrastructures to fuel economic facilities. It means properly rewarded work in a way that has not happened to date through the strengthening of labor unions with an opportunity-based expanding membership to build back better the foundations of the economy. So Lukoski wants to put labor unions and not just businesses at the center of things. Third, the sector breakdown. There are four thematic areas. Commerce organized sectors include, and this is among other areas, transportation in its diverse modes, airports, passenger trains, freight railroad, transit systems, ports, waterways, and bridges. A nationwide network of charging stations, wastewater, clean vehicles, the electrical grid, and what have you. Did he run out of vocabulary there? Climate touches on many of these areas, but also on areas such as solar, wind, and other alternative sources of energy. Battery technology, resiliency, energy efficiency, and other emergent technologies, unquote. Unquote again. Connectivity encompasses areas such as caregiving, high-speed internet, social and civic fabric, housing, economic opportunity-driven facilities with sizable, discernible benefits, education, veterans facilities, healthy water pipes. Well, that doesn't sound like too many Republicans I know. Inventiveness includes research and development, supply chain re-engineering, transformation of advanced manufacturing. Once again, it's about infrastructure. Seems like he ran out of vocabulary in that paragraph too. Fourth, the primary means for operationalizing Biden's vision is through his distinctive brand of mission-driven public-private partnerships. Biden has a signature, distinctive approach to partnerships, an area in which he is well-versed and highly successful. I'd sort of like to see a catalog of all his successes in that area. Because over the years, I really haven't noticed that so much. But going on, these partnerships are defined by federal, state, and local governments, investors, businesses, not-for-profits, and labor unions producing results for Americans together. Well, that's just about everybody, right? These groupings are internally diverse, which requires such things as coordination among Biden's close-knit family of federal agencies. How did the federal agencies suddenly become so close-knit? And why are Biden's federal agencies more close-knit than Trump's federal agencies were? As far as I know, they're the same federal agencies. Lukoski says Biden's partnerships are certainly a science, but in equal measure an art. I have to say, I'm not sure what that means. Fifth are the financing mechanisms which equip these partner enterprises to forge relations and fuel projects. Biden's distinctive partnership approach can be carried out through 10 basic mechanisms. These mechanisms are intimately interlinked with one another in practice. In this respect, his approach to supporting financing is best understood as synthetic financing. I don't know that that term is particularly clarifying, is it for you? Which combines very many mechanisms emanating from diverse agencies together with outside profit and not-for-profit resources. These mechanisms include the following: procurement powers, such as Buy American provisions and service agreements, formula disbursements, maybe that's funding formula disbursements from the federal government, competitive grants, leases and lease enhancements, loans from what particular agencies and instrumentalities. That's really key. Loans and loan guarantees, including revolving funds, bonds, and bond enhancements, zones and equity platforms, tax credits, insurance used sparingly within disaster contexts, and also by regulatory instruments such as permitting. Now, that paragraph is pregnant with possible meaning and certainly could use a breakout into all those categories. Will we see it? I don't think so. A successful Biden partnership program utilizes synthetic financing, combining the usage of these vehicles. The president is extraordinarily experienced and expert in synthetic financing, not only as a U.S. Senator carrying out constituent services or shaping the legislative process, but also in his role carrying out the partnership vehicles within the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. Okay, so that puts a little more flesh on that. He had a good deal of experience as the person who helped out with the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. For those of you who don't know, that was the stimulus bill of 2009 that ostensibly pulled us out of the recession, but only after the longest recession in history. As you advocate for programs and vehicles, or else prepare to use them successfully, ask these questions. How do they fit into Biden's vision? How do they carry forward the drivers of his plan? Well, so far, the vision as stated in this memo is very, very vague. How are we to assess how do they fit into his vision? How do they carry forward the drivers of his plan? Do they fit within his defined sectors? And how? Are they a fit within Biden's distinctive approach to public-private partnerships? What combination of vehicles are being synthesized? In other words, what is your Biden story, says Michael Lukowski. Now, I have to say, I'm not really sure what the drivers of his plan are off this. I'm not really sure what values he's trying to implement, what public purposes he's trying to fulfill. But when I hear public-private partnerships, I always worry about the public pocket getting picked by the private sector in these particular partnerships. Now, there were partnerships during FDR's time, too, between the government and the private sector. But it's notable that the private sector in these partnerships was very carefully controlled, so there was no picking of the public's pockets in these partnerships. There were also public-private partnerships in the Reagan era and the Bush 41 era and the Clinton era and the Bush 43 era and the Obama era, okay, and the Trump era. And in all these eras, the public sector continuously got its pockets picked. So to me, public-private partnerships doesn't mean very much. It's the kind of public-private partnerships that are important. One thing I have to note is that much of infrastructure is going to have to do with transportation. And the refugee from the McKinsey company, specifically Peter Buttigieg, is the Secretary of Transportation. What are his public-private partnerships going to be like? And will McKinsey be excluded from them out of the appearance of a conflict of interest? I certainly hope so, because as we saw from our live stream by just yesterday, the world's expert at picking public pockets is the McKinsey Corporation. The uncontested champion pickpocket of them all is the McKinsey Corporation, and Biden appointed one of them as the Secretary of Transportation. Going on, actually concluding Michael's piece, even members of his opposition party will tell their own Biden story. Once the plan is passed, to commandeer federal support for their local communities, their governors, their mayors, their businesses, both here and on the way. So their purpose is going to be to tell their own Biden story in order to commandeer federal support. Gee, I thought this was going to be a public-private partnership. So if these are going to be partnerships, how is it that the non-federal parts of the partnerships are going to commandeer federal support? Anyway, Michael says, it seems to me the commandeering should be the other way around. But that's just me. If they are eager to do it, says Michael Akosky, so should you be. So straight away, do it the Biden way. I thought that was a singularly empty characterization of the Biden plan, but one that is calculated to make you think about various words and vocabulary used here, and whether it all means that this is an appeal to the private sector to get ready for a big feast at the expense of the public. But maybe I'm just too damn cynical for words. So let's hear some other words about the infrastructure plan, because there are going to be many of them before we're through. First, there's the opinion of U.S. voters. Nearly 2/3 of U.S. voters back corporate tax hike to fund the Biden infrastructure plan. It's by Brett Wilkins, staff writer at Common Dreams, today on April 7th. And there is a picture of Joe B. raising his hands in front of a microphone, discussing his administration's American Jobs Plan in Pittsburgh on March 31st. Roundly rejecting Republican and conservative Democratic lawmakers who oppose President Joe Biden's proposed corporate tax plan to fund the American Jobs Plan, a poll published Wednesday revealed 2/3 of U.S. voters favor high taxes on businesses to pay for the administration's $2.25 trillion infrastructure and employment legislative proposal. And by the way, this was no progressive poll here. This wasn't a Data for Progress poll. This was a Morning Consult poll. Politico itself. Morning Consult pollsters survived nearly 2,000 registered voters surveyed. Surveyed nearly 2,000 registered voters and found that 65% of respondents somewhat or strongly support funding the American Jobs Plan, the AJP, through 15 years of higher corporate taxes, compared with just 21% who somewhat or strongly oppose the move. Democratic voters gave it 85% support, 62% of them strongly, with only 15% against the tax increase. %60 of independents and 42% of Republicans favor funding the AJP through higher corporate taxes, with 47% of the GOP voters opposing the proposed policy. So that's at least fairly evenly divided. There is some support on the Republican side. And of course, the overall support with 60% of independents and 85%. But Democrats is extremely high at 65%. On a broad level, nearly 3/4 of voters agree corporations should pay higher taxes, including 85% of Democrats and 59% of Republicans, said Morning Consult. And there are the results of the poll. I've left a link in the description for this. Oh, you won't be able to find a link to the Lukoski piece because I couldn't get a web version of it. I took it off my email. According to an analysis published Wednesday by the Penn Wharton budget model, Biden's proposal, under which the corporate tax rate would rise from 21% to 28%, would increase government revenue by $891.6 billion between 2022 and 2031, in other words, over 10 years, and by nearly $1.5 billion between 2022 and 2036. 1.49 trillion, sorry. 1.49 trillion. Misspoke there. So, over the 15 years. The Wharton analysts further forecast that overall the AJP would generate $2.1 trillion in tax revenue, while spending $2.7 trillion between 2021 and 2030. The higher corporate tax rate, combined with improved U.S. infrastructure, is expected to decrease the nation's debt by 6.4% and its GDP by 0.8% in 2050. So tell me why it's good that it's going to decrease GDP by 0.8% in 2050. Tell me why it's good that it's going to decrease the nation's debt. Because I think that the Wharton projection here most probably projects that the way the nation's debt would be decreased is through running surpluses somewhere along the line here, which means subtracting dollars from the private sector. Why is that good? Why is that good? Or as I heard John Campbell say today, good. Why is that good? A separate poll published Tuesday by Invest in America and Data for Progress found that a bipartisan majority of U.S. voters, 73% overall, 93% of Democrats, 67% of independents, and 50% of Republicans support the AJP in general. The Morning Consult poll found even higher overall support for the plan when the proposed corporate tax hike is withdrawn, with approval rising to 83% among all voters. Wow. So it's even more popular not to raise the taxes? So you mean to tell me that the American public, taken as a whole, is not so concerned with paying down the debt that it doesn't even support increased corporate taxes? And well, of course it does. I mean, it favors the taxes in the plan. So it does. But somehow the approval rating of the whole thing goes up when the corporate taxes aren't in it. Think how popular just a pure spending bill would be with no taxes in it, which is the right way to do things. Let's have that pure spending infrastructure bill first. Then let's have a separate tax bill. And let's see who has the stomach to levy the quantity and type of taxes, types of targeted taxes that would be necessary to control inflation. I'd really love to see that. Anyway, there's much talk here in this article about diving more deeply into the results. Jeff Bezos supports the AJP, evidently, and supports the tax part of it. On Rising this morning, they were pointing out, well, of course he does. He knows that the tax rate really doesn't mean anything because Amazon doesn't pay any taxes. it manages to take advantage of all the loopholes, okay, in the taxing bill. It doesn't matter to them whether the rate is 70% or whether the rate is 20% or whether it's 5%, okay, or whether it's 28%. That's all window dressing. What counts is the loopholes they use to get to negative taxation. Because yes, they have negative taxation. Amazon gets money back from the federal government, in spite of the fact that they have these huge profits that make Jeff Bezos the richest man in the world, or contribute to that anyway. Of course, it's the fact that it's the stock market that's making him the richest man in the world, not strictly speaking the profits. On the other hand, Republicans in Congress and conservative Dems, led by Senator Joe Manchin, strongly opposed the corporate tax increase component to the AJP. I wouldn't say that. Joe Manchin said he's willing to compromise on 25% as opposed to 28%. That's something like, something like, he'll go 60% of the way. So let's say that it's 60% of the way. So the AJP then would generate what, about 1.5 trillion, okay, in tax revenue, as opposed to 2.1 trillion, or maybe 1.3 trillion. Let's say 1.3 trillion, as opposed to 2.1 trillion, okay, in tax revenue. So that's over what, between 2021 and 2030. So over 9 years, that's about $800 million that in revenue that the federal government would not get from the taxes over 9 years. So let's say in round figures, we're talking less than 100 billion per year. I mean, that's peanuts. That's nowhere near the kind of deficit we need in order to put money into the private sector so that people can save and so that they can import goods, okay, from abroad. We need more space for the private sector to operate. That means we need much higher deficits. 100 billion a year just isn't going to do it. These people don't know what they're complaining about. They really don't. They really don't have a clue, because MMT perspectives are not yet framing the way they look at the economy and these policies. So let's now move to the highlight of tonight, Stephanie Kelton's brilliant column for the New York Times. And let me share that with you. I do not know what's going on here. Sorry, folks. My system hung. But I'm now back. I see that I still am live. Yes, I was frozen. I am now going to Stephanie's piece once again. Don't know why my system hung. This system has never hung before. But here we are now. You should be sharing it. Okay, I think you have it. So let me get to Stephanie's post now and give you a commentary on it. Biden can go bigger and not, quote, pay for it the old way. By focusing on how much the revenue they hope to raise from tax increases on the well-off, Democrats risk limiting the scope of their ambitions. This was today, April 7th. And the caption on that photo is, or I should say inside that graphic is dead end. And it's a picture of 1040s saying taxing is a dead end. That's what that says. The photo is by Matt Chase. Last week, President Biden introduced a $2.2 trillion infrastructure plan in a speech calling it, quote, a once-in-a-generation investment in America. And on Wednesday, he and the Treasury Department outlined many of the package's details, including how to, quote, pay for, unquote, it. A close look at those so-called pay-fors, however, shows Democrats are thinking about fiscal responsibility the wrong way. Just imagine. They're thinking about fiscal responsibility the wrong way even after I've written 2 books about real fiscal responsibility. Actually, it's 1 book in 2 volumes, but there it is. Okay. Trying to teach people what real fiscal responsibility is. Anyway, they could be on the verge of sparking some unpleasant short-term overheating of the economy, in which price increases accelerate and the purchasing power of our dollar falls somewhat. If the final legislation were to grow much larger, toward the $10 trillion level that many progressives in Congress are pushing, it could send such inflation soaring. In an interview on MSNBC last week, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of New York explained her mixed feelings about the president's proposal, saying that she has, quote, very serious concerns. It's not enough to realize the very inspiring vision that Mr. Biden has advanced. I believe I said that myself, right? The first time I talked about the infrastructure bill, I said the scale of it doesn't match the goals it supposedly has. Rather than spending roughly $2 trillion over 8 years, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez and many of her progressive caucus colleagues would prefer, quote, to go way higher, unquote, and on a shorter timeline. She's right that it is possible for Congress and the Biden administration to go bigger faster, but only by shifting to a completely different budgeting framework. Instead of passing legislation that leans on taxing corporations and the rich to keep spending from increasing the deficit, they would have to develop a robust plan with a focus on containing inflationary pressures as that heightened government spending hits the real economy. The president called his plan, quote, fiscally responsible, unquote, during his speech simply because it will raise more revenue than what he's proposing to spend on paper. And according to conventional wisdom, this is balanced policy. It may satisfy the scorekeepers of the CBO or even earn high marks from deficit hawks. But because these proposed hikes fall exclusively on corporations and more affluent Americans who have a relatively high marginal propensity to save rather than spend, the taxes may not diminish enough private sector spending to prevent the government's own increased outlays from igniting some inflationary overheating, especially if Congress does, quote, go way higher, unquote. The key to responsibly spending vast sums of money lies in carefully managing the economy's real productive limitations. Just as my son's Lego projects are limited by the amount of bricks we have bought for him, we can't squeeze more goods and services out of our economy once we've made use of all available resources. It's easy to ramp up spending when there are millions of unemployed people who can be hired, and plenty of domestic companies eager to supply the government with solar panels and electric vehicles. But what happens when it gets harder to find the idle things and people, construction workers, architects, also machinery, the raw materials, and so on, needed to keep pace with an enormous revamp of our nation's infrastructure? With the U.S. economy now improving, it would be irresponsible not to develop a rollout plan for those contingencies. And guess what? The Biden administration has no rollout plan for these contingencies because it does not understand, as MMT economists do, that inflation can start in different sectors of the economy due to shortages of resources in those particular sectors. We have to have maps of those sectors and of the resources in those sectors and of the money flowing into those particular sectors to get an idea of whether we have the resources necessary to contain inflation, any possible inflation. And moreover, this doesn't have much to do with the deficits. We could have substantial macroeconomic deficits and still not get the heavy spending that would have to occur in sectors where there are shortages to cause inflation. We have to have an expectation of how and where the money that comes from government spending, whether deficit or not, where it's going to flow in the economy, and whether those sectors where it will be flowing into are also sectors that are short of workers, okay, and raw materials and the other things that are needed to produce what people have the money to buy. With the U.S. economy now improving, it would be irresponsible not to develop a rollout plan for those contingencies. Okay, I repeat that because that's what the Biden administration doesn't purport to have. Many of Mr. Biden's proposed tax increases should be defended and even even lauded, for they will promote greater fairness and curb inequality somewhat. But it must be recognized that they will do relatively little to offset spending pressures. Depending on how big Congress ultimately decides to go on infrastructure and how quickly, it may need to unleash a whole suite of inflation dampening policies along the way. All of it unrelated to deficit neutrality. Now, that's a key thing to emphasize. All of it unrelated to deficit neutrality. In fact, I would argue we don't want deficit neutrality. We want to spend in those areas where the policy space actually exists. Spending in those areas may be the very key to driving down the enormous levels of inequality we have in our economy right now. They may be very key to a just transition to the climate crisis. So we don't want the deficit neutrality, but we also don't want the deficit spending going into the wrong places. We need really good analyses to be able to square that particular circle. These non-tax inflation offsets could include industrial policies like much more aggressively increasing our domestic manufacturing capacity by steering investment back to U.S. shores. Looks like Joe Biden's going to try to do that. Using even more carrot incentives like direct federal procurement, grants and loans, as well as more sticks, quote unquote, like levying new taxes to discourage the offshoring of plants. Reforming trade policies is another option. Repealing tariffs would make it easier and cheaper for American businesses to buy supplies manufactured abroad, and easier for consumers to spend more of their income on products made outside of our borders, draining off some domestic demand pressures. So, what she's saying is that if we buy a certain amount of foreign goods, this demand leakage to the private sector can give us more policy space for domestic spending. The Biden team can also consider loosening its legal immigration policies so that even once America nears full employment, there would still be an adequate labor pool to meet the increased demand for workers. Now, on the web today, on Twitter, someone replied to a tweet, I put forward, by saying, "Oh, so you mean America's workers won't be getting any raises because we'll be allowing more immigration to come in to meet the increased demand for workers?" To which I replied, "Don't put words in Stephanie Kelton's mouth. She's a proponent of the federal job guarantee at a living wage, which of course would provide work to all the people who want it at a living wage, which would increase the median level of the wage paid in America right now. Putting aside the obvious climate benefits of tightening environmental regulations," says Stephanie, Banning fracking on federal lands and offshore drilling in federal waters could free up people, okay, and also material for other activities. Healthcare reform could have a role too, significantly lowering the Medicare eligibility age would sharply reduce aggregate spending in the healthcare industry, a major source of price pressures in the economy. I have to add, even better would be passing Medicare for all, because that would greatly reduce over a period of time, not too long a time, a period of adjustment to the Medicare for all system. We would arguably be spending less than 1/3 of what we're spending now in total healthcare spending. That would sharply reduce aggregate spending on healthcare in that industry and radically reduce some of the price pressures in the economy. Over time, the Biden's plans investments in our physical and human infrastructure will enhance our economy's productive capacity, leaving us with a better educated and more productive workforce, more efficient railways, less congested roadways, improved technologies, and much else. But this can't happen overnight. It will take years, and it might mean that we start to run out of available capacity as we go, especially if the House, if the Congressional Progressive Caucus wins the addition of trillions more dollars. No one can predict exactly when or across which industries serious bottlenecks and other shortages might emerge. That's why, to avoid short-run constraints like supply bottlenecks, the U.S. government can look elsewhere for capacity. Our businesses can make use of depressed conditions abroad, buying from countries with economies that might be struggling to fully recover from the economic downturn, and that will be more than happy to mutually benefit from our boom. There will be no lack of eager foreign producers if we need to relieve some demand pressure on the domestic front. So it was unfortunate that in his long-awaited infrastructure speech, President Biden promised, quote, not a contract will go out that I control, unquote, that isn't for, quote, a company that is an American company with American products all the way down the line and American workers, unquote. This, quote, buy American, unquote, philosophy is well-intentioned, but could lead to counterproductive trouble, particularly since the president has promised that, quote, no one making under $400,000 will see their federal taxes go up, unquote. A pledge that takes raising taxes on the middle class, which has a higher, has a higher marginal propensity to spend, off the table as a potential inflation offset. And she goes on to say that a Biden-led plan that is overly protectionist is a much greater inflation threat than a plan that isn't paid for in the traditional deficit-neutral budgetary sense. So in other words, Biden should be more worried about his plan being overly protectionist and also less worried about whether the corporate tax rate goes up to 28% as opposed to 25%, maybe. This framework based on the principles of modern monetary theory, redefines fiscal responsibility by flipping the age-old question, quote, how will you pay for it, unquote. The real challenge is, quote, how will you resource it, unquote. Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont recently hinted at this approach when he said to Politico, quote, you don't start off by coming up with a sum and working down. You start out by looking at the needs that need to be addressed and adding them up, unquote. The next step is to figure out how to budget your available real resources to deliver on those priorities. So that was Stephanie's contribution, and I think it was a great one. One of the reasons why, it's a great one, is because if you read it carefully, you can see that the MMT perspective does not always result in the outlines, of policies that conform to silly, stereotypical versions, of MMT, as advocating for constantly printing money or just spending without concern or without care for the consequences. Stephanie's view of the infrastructure plan is a very nuanced view, and it's about trying to figure out the details of the impact of the infrastructure plan, not the aggregate impact of the infrastructure plan, but the impact of the infrastructure plan in the various sectors of our economy, because that is what is necessary to make sure that we will not, in the end, have an aggregate inflationary impact that we are not able to handle. Stephanie goes on. The modern monetary theory is not alone here. For a historical outlook, we can visit what John Maynard Keynes proposed in, quote, How to Pay for the War, a radical plan for the Chancellor of the Exchequer, unquote, a lesser-known work of his. To the contemporary ear, the title suggests that Keynes was trying to figure out how to come up with the money to finance World War II spending. He wasn't. Keynes understood that the British government, which controlled its national currency, could create all the money needed. The purpose of the book was to show the government how to scale up and sustain higher levels of spending while containing inflationary pressures along the way. It noted the soldiers, bombers, tanks, combat gear, and more that would be needed to prosecute the war, and how the entire economy would need to be reoriented quickly to supply those things. We've all grown accustomed to thinking about taxes as an important source of revenue for the federal government. That's in part because it's easy to think of the federal government as being like state and local governments, which, without sufficient revenue from income taxes, property taxes, sales taxes, and more, could not finance their operations. Yet these entities don't have the federal government's currency issuing powers, which greatly changes the spending capacity of government. 1945, a man named Beardsley Rummel delivered a fiery speech before the American Bar Association titled, quote, Taxes for Revenue are Obsolete, unquote. He wasn't a crank. He was the chairman of the New York Federal Reserve Bank. have to say, I'm not sure that's a guarantee that he wasn't a crank, but I will accept that he at least, was not a crank. When it comes to some other chair people of the Federal Reserve, since the start of the Federal Reserve, I might not have such a kind assessment. As Mr. Rummel explained in that speech, taxes first and foremost help to avoid a situation where too much money chases after too few goods. Quote, the dollars the government spends become purchasing power in the hands of the people who have received them, unquote, he said. While, quote again, the dollars the government takes by taxes cannot be spent by the people, unquote. More recently, economists like L. Randall Wray and Eva Nersessian have begun to think about how to pay for a Green New Deal using Keynes's earlier, quote, a radical, unquote, framework. And even if one were to accept the terms of the old deficit-oriented budgeting currently favored in Washington, going even bigger on infrastructure, if executed carefully, is still doable. Larry Summers, the former Obama White House senior economist, admitted in 2014 that, quote, public infrastructure investments can pay for themselves, unquote. And that, quote, by increasing the economy's capacity, infrastructure investment increases the ability to handle any given level of debt, unquote. We face enormous intersecting crises. A climate crisis, jobs crisis, this is Stephanie, health crisis, and housing crisis, among others. It is going to require a lot of money to do what is necessary. As Kate Aronoff recently wrote, in the New Republic, quote, to meet the emissions targets outlined in the Paris Agreement, experts estimate the United States government will need to spend at least $1 trillion annually, unquote. And the White House's infrastructure proposal, while historically ambitious, still falls far short of the scale of the problem. Ms. Ocasio-Cortez pointed out, for instance, that Mr. Biden's plan has a $40 billion investment in public housing for the entire nation. But New York alone may have that level of need. And I'm not sure Ocasio-Cortez was talking about the state of New York there. She might very well have been talking about the city of New York having that level of need. By focusing on how much revenue they think they can raise from a broad array of tax increases on the well-off, says Stephanie, Democrats risk allowing the scope of their ambitions to be governed by the dated framework of fiscal responsibility in Washington. That, folks, is the old Pearsonian framework that governed Washington for so long, the neoliberal fiscal responsibility framework. Going on with Stephanie, and the political appetite for tax increases rather than what is truly possible based on logistics in the real economy. The Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Federal Reserve, the Treasury Department, and other agencies that track labor force participation, price increases, and supply shortages can be tasked with developing a specific dashboard of blinkers and warnings. If Congress and the White House want to be responsible stewards of both society and the U.S. dollar's value, then rather than focusing on taxation of the rich, they should prioritize and supply exactly what it would take in terms of real resources to electrify the nation's power grid, repair every deficient bridge, give caretakers a living wage, upgrade our railways, and deliver clean drinking water and high-speed broadband to every home. Folks, this is way beyond a chicken in every pot and a car in every garage. way beyond. How much steel, concrete, and fiber optic cable, how many tower cranes and other kinds of building equipment will be needed? The list goes on. These are the questions we should ask our leaders, and the ones they should be asking themselves, not, quote, how will we pay for it, unquote. I hope you'll agree. That was a tremendous article. When I saw it this morning, I just thought, boy, she really hit it out of the park, right on the nose. Right on the nose. Now let me go to a few postscripts. First, there is Jamaal Bowman. These won't take very long. This is from Common Dreams, Kenny Stansel, April 7th. Beyond bridges and roads, Bowman makes case for, quote, care infrastructure. This one has to do with the belly aching, of the GOP, specifically, to go to the article. In response to GOP's misleading accusations that only a small portion of President Joe Biden's overwhelmingly popular American Jobs Plan is devoted to, quote, real infrastructure, unquote, by Representative Jamaal Bowman argued Tuesday that the United States would benefit from adopting a more expansive understanding of infrastructure. One that includes not only building roads, but also expanding public goods and investing in care workers who sustain the country. Quote, the way we think about infrastructure itself needs a rethink. What we need to understand better as a nation is that our infrastructure does not just look like steel, concrete, and transport. It is also the nurturing patience and diligence of care workers. But this appeared in an op-ed published by The Guardian, and the link is in the Common Dreams article. Quote again, care work touches all of our lives from beginning to end, from the unpaid labor of those who raise us as children, child care workers, teachers, home aides, and healthcare workers, to those who care for us in old age and see us through the end of our lives, unquote. Care is one of the strongest pillars of our economy, yet those who do this work, disproportionately black and brown, the women often immigrants, are undersupported, undervalued, and undercompensated, if compensated at all, unquote. He added that just as our physical infrastructure is crumbling and requires substantial reinvestment in the 21st century economy, our care infrastructure is fundamentally broken, unquote. But the U.S., Bowman pointed out, is, quote, the only industrialized country in the world without a national paid family and medical leave program. As the progressive lawmaker explained, a lack of economic rights and social protection has profound consequences, quoting from him again. Only 17% of our people have paid family leave through their employers. Hundreds of thousands face daunting wait lists for essential home care. Child care is the highest household expense for families in much of the United States, and the median annual pay of child care and home workers is $25,510 and $17,200 respectively, leading to high turnover and reliance on public assistance. I have to remind you that a $15 an hour minimum wage, which is not yet a living wage, we all agree it's not yet a living wage, but a job guarantee program, even at a $15 an hour minimum wage, would be at $33,200 a year. Okay, I believe it is, if I remember correctly. That's very close to it, okay, in any case. And one at a true living wage would probably average across the country something like $38,000 or $39,000 a year. So that's how underpaid child care and home care workers are. The Biden administration can and must, and here's another quote from Bowman, quote, can and must center care work as part of rebuilding the country, unquote. And he urged the president and Congress to address, quote again, longstanding injustices as part of the next investment in infrastructure, specifically by, quote, passing universal child care and pre-K, 6 months of paid family leave, and free quality home and community-based services for seniors and people with disabilities, along with Medicare for all. And of course, he's right about all this, but it's also true that even more, we need the care workers to have wages that at least would match those that would be enacted as a living wage in the context of a federal job guarantee program. That's one of the big reasons why we need a federal job guarantee program, because whether the care workers are going to work for such a program or not, the private sector businesses that would provide such care would have to raise the wages of those workers to a level higher than the living wage level of the federal job guarantee program, because that would become the de facto living wage. This tweet, okay, from Bernie Sanders. What is infrastructure in this country? Roads, bridges, our energy grid, broadband, childcare, dental vision, and hearing care for the elderly. Now is the time to begin addressing our physical infrastructure as well as our human infrastructure. And let's get it done. And I can't resist saying that my handle at Daily Costs is let's get it done. Bowman's arguments are at the center of what the New York Times earlier this week called a, quote, philosophical, unquote, debate about the meaning of infrastructure. Whereas right-wing economist R. Glenn Hubbard told the Times that, quote, much of what is in the American Jobs Act is really social spending, not productivity-enhancing infrastructure of any kind, unquote. However, proponents of a more expansive definition, quote, argue that in the 21st century, anything that helps people work and lead productive or fulfilling lives counts as infrastructure, the newspaper noted. And Cecilia Rouse, the chair of the White House Council of Economic Advisors, said to the newspaper, quote, I couldn't be going to work if I had to take care of my parents. How is that not infrastructure, unquote? It should be, according to many advocates, including Bowman, who said that, quote, strong care programs also boost the economy. So you get the picture. There is a merging and expanded concept, okay, of infrastructure. And then Cecil, an economics professor at Wellesley and a former Federal Reserve official, said, it could be helpful to think of what comprises infrastructure as a series of concentric circles, a basic inner band made up of roads and bridges, a larger social ring of schools and hospitals, then a digital layer, including things like cloud computing, There could also be an intangible layer like open source software or weather data. It is definitely an amorphous concept, he said, but basically, quote, we mean key economic assets that support and enable economic activity. The economy has evolved since the 1950s. Manufacturers used to employ about a third of the workforce, but now count for just 8.5% of jobs in the United States. Because the economy has changed, it is important that our definitions are updated, Mr. Cecil said. And there's more from Bowman here. I'm going to end this, though. You're getting the picture. What's emerging is a more comprehensive idea of what is included in infrastructure, and such an idea is shortly going to feed in to infrastructure bills, expanded infrastructure bills, more comprehensive infrastructure bills. And in the pursuit of those, I want to go to our last article today, specifically a piece from Daily Costs. I very rarely use pieces, from Daily Costs. But this one is a good summary by Joan Carter of the recent news that Democrats win critical procedural tool to pass infrastructure, but putting McConnell in a jam. And Schumer can continue to turn his back on McConnell, which must be really satisfying. Says the caption of that particular photo. Chuck Schumer announced a mini bombshell Monday night, one which dramatically improves the outlook for President Biden's infrastructure plans. Quote, the parliamentarian has advised that a revised budget by resolution may contain budget reconciliation instructions, unquote. A spokesman for Schumer announced in plain English that means Schumer has that, quote, magical parliamentary trick, unquote. I don't know if that's so explanatory of what it means, but he can use part of the 1974 Budget Act, Section 304, that allows the Senate to bring up previously passed and signed budget resolutions, like the American Rescue Plan COVID relief bill, and amend them and include new stuff. Now that is in plain language. They can bring up the American Rescue Plan and change the budget, the resolution, and include new stuff like infrastructure. This, quote, allows Democrats additional tools to improve the lives of Americans if Republican obstruction continues. So this means that this fiscal year, the Democrats would be able to pass basically two new infrastructure bills by revising the budget resolution of the American Rescue Plan that accompanied the American Rescue Plan. Quote again from Schumer, while no decisions have been made on a legislative path forward, the parliamentarian's opinion is an important step forward that this key pathway is available to Democrats if needed. That was seconded by Ron Wyden, chair of the Senate, the Finance Committee. And then there's Bernie right there. It's important because it gives us a little more flexibility. We don't have to push everything into one package. Quote, the ruling of the parliamentarian gives us a little bit more opportunity in that particular direction. And I have to add one of my favorite hobby horses here. Yes, it gives you more flexibility. You can go for one round, of amendments of the earlier resolution on infrastructure spending. And then you can go with a completely separate round on infrastructure taxing. And as I say, that is very, very important because people will vote for the spending who will not vote for the taxing, and vice versa. So, if you put them both in separate packages, you have a much better opportunity of getting to your goals. And that's the way it should be anyway, because generally speaking, there should be deficit spending. There should be additions of money, contributions of money each year, contributions of net financial assets, not simply money, net financial assets from the Treasury going to the private sector each fiscal year. If you're living in an economy like the United States that has current account deficits and savings desires. This theoretically gives the Senate majority at least 2 more opportunities to use budget reconciliation. The bills that have special rules which allow them to pass with a simple majority vote bypassing the 60-vote majority. I'm not sure what Joan McCarter is referring to here. I would agree with the 2 more opportunities, but I think the 2 more opportunities apply to fiscal 2021. You have to remember, fiscal 2022 starts in October. And then there are a whole set of new opportunities that come up. Previously, the Senate has operated under the general rule that it could be used a maximum of twice a year. It has been infrequently used because it takes up a ton of floor time with unlimited amendments being available to both parties in the Senate. There are reasons Schumer might decide not to use it because of that, the vote-a-rama, and nearly unlimited ability for the Republicans to attempt to do their worst on the Senate floor. Senator Mitch McConnell has already ruled out doing anything to pass a plan that will create potentially millions of jobs and prevent kids from being poisoned by lead in their drinking water. Quote, I'm going to fight them every step of the way because I think this is the wrong prescription for America, McConnell said last week. Quote, that package they're putting together right now, as much as we would like to address infrastructure, is not going to get support from our side. Schumer now has choices, and that has the power to splinter Republicans. And again, I come back to the separate spending and taxing bills because that is very important for strategy. Joe Biden certainly has a majority of 51 votes for a spending bill, on infrastructure, where it's understood the taxing bill will come later. If they pass that spending bill, then they get what he needs and what he wants and what the American people will want too in relation to infrastructure, including an opportunity for progressives to add trillions to the infrastructure spending bill under reconciliation. And that will allow Democrats to collaborate on that and pull together the 51 votes. And it will also cause some of the Republicans to split off because this is their opportunity to get stuff for their districts. The earmarks are back. And they're going to want to get what was previously spoken of as pork, but now can be very valuable infrastructures for their states and local communities. So everybody's going to want to participate in that particular barbecue. It's going to be a party for them. then if you come in later with a separate tax bill, that splits the Republican Party. That splits them right down the middle, more than it splits the Democratic Party. Because they won't want a tax. They won't want a tax. But some of them are going to be fiscal responsibility deficit hawks. Yeah, they're great at not wanting to tax when spending by Democrats is in the same bill, because then they know that the Democrats won't be able to spend and they'll lose advantage politically. But if the spending is already done, if it's already passed, and then the taxing comes, then the burden of the taxing will fall on the fiscal hawks, Democratic fiscal hawks and Republican fiscal hawks alike. And their stomach for deficit neutrality will then not be nearly as great as it is now. And having that kind of political situation in Congress is what we need to have nice things, folks. If we want nice things, we need that kind of strategy from the Democrats. Here's the biggest opportunity. Republicans have to bring money and jobs to their states and districts. Now that both the Senate and House have decided they will bring back earmarks. So Joan McCarter is making that point. The member directed spending for specific projects at home. The package Biden has introduced has plenty of potential for those goodies, even though Republicans are busily trying to restrict the definition of, quote, infrastructure, unquote, to just roads and bridges. Biden has an answer for that, and it not surprisingly includes Republican hypocrisy. Quote from Biden, "It's kind of interesting that when the Republicans put forward an infrastructure plan, they thought everything from broadband to dealing with other things," unquote, Biden said Monday. Quote, "Their definition of infrastructure has changed," unquote. He went on to talk about what infrastructure really is. It's kind of similar to Bowman. When I'm talking about making sure that you take that asbestos out of schools, that's infrastructure, Biden said. Quote again, when I'm talking about building high-speed rail, that's infrastructure. When I'm talking about making sure you're in a safe situation where we can redo some of the federal buildings that are just absolutely leaking energy every single day, that's infrastructure, unquote. One gets the sense that Republicans are just recycling the arguments they made to the American Rescue Plan. I remember how they kept talking about how it wasn't really about dealing with coronavirus, that there was all that extra stuff in it. How they made a counteroffer of $600 billion for a plan. On Fox News Sunday, Senator Roy Blunt said that maybe Republicans would be okay with $615 billion for an infrastructure plan. He also argued that only about a third of Biden's plan focuses on what Republicans are calling real infrastructure projects. It's deja vu all over again. Thank you, Yogi. A Republican Senate aide reacted predictably to the ruling, saying that it is, quote, an abuse of the process, and clearly not what the reconciliation was designed to do. But they're going to go forward anyway, unquote. Except for the part where 20 years ago Republicans fired the parliamentarian in part because of his ruling, quote, that only one tax bill could be considered this year under special budget rules that prevent filibusters, unquote. Expect more of that hypocrisy from Republicans as the process moves forward, because that's all they have. They've got hypocrisy all the time. But the problem is, when they're in power, they get to implement the hypocrisy all the time. They use the hypocrisy when they're not in power, but then it doesn't matter. And when we get to point that out, or when others get to point that out, then the hypocrisy does matter because they don't have the power. This puts them in a bit of a jam, says Joan McCarter, knowing that Schumer and the Democrats could move forward on this plan without them. Could bring at least some of them to the table. It could. It could bring maybe 10 of them to the table in the House, or more, maybe 20 of them in the House, and maybe 8 of them in the Senate. It can bring Lisa Murkowski to the table. It can bring Susan Collins to the table. It can bring Mitt Romney to the table. It can maybe bring a good many of them to the table. We shall see. Because this is a bill they can get tangible, popular stuff from if they play along. If they don't, there's no guarantee Democrats will do anything more than the bare minimum for Republican states. So Republicans will get a chance to trade their votes for good things for Republican states. But they're going to have to cooperate. They might even have to get rid of Mitch McConnell as the majority leader. I suggest, because it may be the case that Mitch McConnell can't hold his caucus anymore, that he can't enforce 50 votes to go in the direction that he wants to go in. Maybe that's about to happen if the Democrats follow the strategy of doing the spending first and the taxing second. Boy, would that be good. Would that be good? And who knows what else, it would lead to. Okay, I'm done with my part of tonight. I now go to your part. Sorry about the interruption before. It was just a fluke. When I tried to share, it just kind of flicked in the wrong way. Everything started spinning around and it hung up the system. Okay, let's get to Lana shared to Twitter. Thank you, Lana. And Lana then said multitasking. Kay Clark said shared. Dia said, so I read that AOC donated to the centrists to keep by Republicans from winning their seats. Interesting. That's what AOC said. I don't believe her for a minute. I really don't believe her for a minute. I think it was just ill-conceived and silly to do that. $5,000 is not going to stop Republicans from winning their seats. What will stop Republicans from winning Abigail Spanberger's seat is if she runs on Medicare for All and the Green New Deal. That's what will save her seat. The same for Elaine Luria, the same for Alyssa Slotkin, the same for all those centrists. 88% of Democrats favor Medicare for All. A Democratic candidate for Congress running against Medicare for All is a person running against their constituents and for their donors. And AOC's $5,000 is not going to help them, but it might help Paula Jean Swearingen in West Virginia. Dia says, evening, Lana. How are you holding up concerning vaccine fatigue? Dia says, yes, we better start building things here. China and Taiwan are talking about war until the end. Well, I don't know what chance Taiwan has, okay, if China really wants to go to war. And I don't really know if we would go to war to back Taiwan up. But Taiwan is quite wealthy now. And there are the straits between China and Taiwan. China does have to cross the straits if they want to absorb Taiwan. Of course, there's no way the Taiwanese can eventually stop it from happening. China is simply too powerful. But we have to recognize that Taiwan has always been a part of China. Always, always, always. Even when the Japanese were occupying part of Japan, they recognized that Taiwan, what they called Formosa, was a part, okay, of China. Anyway, Dia Swift says maybe he's having migraines or something. That will make you run out of vocabulary quickly. Dia says sounds like artsy fartsy vocabulary, laugh out loud. Kay says, oh, bummer, failed in 2009, yes, and in 2010, in 2011, in 2012, 13, 14, 15, and 16. And Trump became the president of the United States. Dia says, well, I guess we better research if McKinsey or their related entities donated to the Biden campaign. Are you kidding? Yeah, they were big contributors to the Biden campaign. That will explain if the Buttigieg will rob the Treasury in 9 different languages as a proxy for McKinsey. Well, I'm afraid we have to generate a lot of public pressure continuously to prevent that sort of thing from going on. There has to be a just huge searchlight continuously on the Department of Transportation and any possible conflict between Buttigieg, any possible conflict of interest between he and McKinsey. Dia, thank you for asking. Aside from some sore spot where the needle went, I am fine today getting on my treadmill. That's, I think, a normal reaction to the vaccine. It may be a little harder when you get the second shot. Dia says, okay, thanks for your reply, getting on my snacks. Kay says, the rich and corporations need to pay more. And Lana smiles. They do need to pay more. They do need to pay more. But there's a time and a place for everything. We right now have problems to solve. And we need the proper kind of deficit spending to solve those problems. Maybe taxing the rich will help us to solve them. Maybe the taxing rich will not be, it could be taxing the rich at this point will not be very helpful. We have to carefully assess that. I don't think Biden carefully assessed it. Dropped MNT in the New York Times Facebook page. recently and got into a UBI debate. All in all, a productive week. Susan Eldridge says that was actually it was Rahul Majumdar who just contributed that. Thank you, Rahul. Susan says hello. Hello, Susan. Susan Eldridge, that is. Dia Swift says, I hear Final Jeopardy music. Lost stream. Warren Chamberlain said, the increase in the corporate tax just refunds to the government more of the economic rent and increased profits those corporations will reap from the new investment of the government to the economy. It depends on if the government allows them to reap those profits. Susan points out Frozen. And this is probably a stupid update, lingering Dr. F. And Warren says, you are back. Warren Chamberlain says this, yes. I was back at 9:47. And Nina Turner retweeted Kelton's New York Times op-ed today. Yeah, I heard that too. Gay says, glad to hear that, Susan. Warren Chamberlain says, now that it seems that the two parties have changed ideological spaces, they should also exchange mascots. The GOP are the new donkeys. Biden is the new bull moose. Well, the bull moose hasn't been the mascot of any political party since Teddy Roosevelt's Progressive Party. That was back in 2012. Warren Chamberlain says, what about the shortage, of microchips? Warren says, we have to look out for our supply chains. Yes, we do. We have to re-engineer our supply chains. Evelina says, there's a brain drain in the U.S. Sometimes I wonder. Kay says, no wondering, Evelina, there is. Dia Swift says, the U.S. needs to buy a Suez Canal tanker full of Asian advanced instru-like COVID particle testers. Warren Chamberlain says, we'll always need legal migrant workers for the agricultural sectors. We need legal migrant workers for lots and lots of sectors. We should make it a lot easier for them to get in, but we should also ensure that they get in order to work for sectors where there was already tight employment and a very tight supply, of labor. We need to have them come in those areas where we really need them, of course. Dia Swift says, correction, instruments like, Jesus says, just lower the Medicare eligibility age to 0. Healthcare is a God-given birthright. We have to do more than that. We have to lower the eligibility age to 0, and we have to make it expanded Medicare for all, specifically the provisions that are in H.R. 1976, Jesus. So look up that bill now, and you realize that's not just a lowering, of Medicare eligibility age to 0. It's a re-engineering, of Medicare into a much improved healthcare program. Evelina says, yes, I would guess. Evelina says, lessons illegal in migration. Deborah says, my word is my bond. Hi, Deborah. Evelina says, migrants can maintain entire families back in Mexico, believe it or not. I do believe it. I believe they can make enough here to maintain their families back in Mexico. but they do live very, very tight here. Dia says, Biden needs to expand his horizons. Evelina says, laugh out loud, put your mouth where your money is. Warren Chamberlain says, when Kennedy was president, they were talking about what they called dynamic budgeting. It was zero-based budgeting, which called for a balanced budget at full employment, or in other words, a balanced economy. Yes, they did talk about that. However, it is not necessarily the case that there should be a balanced budget, okay, at full employment. And the reason why it isn't necessarily the case is because we run current account deficits every year, and there are also leakages to savings in our economy because people want to save. It is probable that if the savings desires of people get fulfilled, and also the desires to import goods are fulfilled, that the natural leakage of U.S. funds that will occur to savings and to foreign countries will be as much as 12%, okay, of GDP. If that is true, then we in the United States will need to maintain continuous deficit spending of 12% of GDP year after year after year, as long as those leakages continue to exist. Kay says, the low-income apartment I used to live in was run by a New York City company, and it sucked. They nickeled and dimed us to death there. Corrupt. Dia says, the infrastructure bill will help to reduce crime in so many ways. Dia says, the elder abuse would drop if care workers were paid what they are worth, probably. Quote, dynamic budgeting, unquote, sounds like too much work for those who have become comfy with corporations calling the shots. And Warren says, the federal treasury and Congress may need to learn to do what we have historically relied on our commercial banks to do by the expansion of the money supply as direct government spending and investment rather than credit created by the banks as debt. Yes, MMT prefers the fiscal policy to monetary policy. In fact, the general recommendation, okay, of MMT is for monetary policy to keep the federal funds rate, okay, at zero, because that is the natural rate of interest, okay, for the economy, and to make the fiscal adjustments not simply to the money supply, but to the supply of net financial assets. Because generally what the Federal Reserve does when it expands the money supply, as you say, it expands the money supply as debt, so it doesn't create any net financial assets. But okay, the name of the game to make people better off is to increase net financial assets. That requires federal deficit spending. Evelina says they know how. They need to muster the political will. Warren says, and grassroots support. Right now, they got a lot of grassroots support. Kay says, not holding my breath on that, Evelina. Hate how Dems often choose to overlook the obvious. Seems like they like playing the fools. Warren Chamberlain says, more ornaments for our national Christmas tree. Evelina says, does it occur to them that they don't fool everybody? Warren Chamberlain says, we can have nice things. Ghost Start says, North Las Vegas Mayor John Lee switches to the GOP in protest of socialists, okay, the Democratic Party. Great, great, go, go, go. That's all right. Too many Dems are also bought and paid for by corporate owners, says Kay, and Warren Chamberlain says, you can't fool all the people all the time. Maybe not, but they're doing a pretty good job of trying. They've been fooling a lot of the people all the time. Evelina Pont says, there you go. And Evelina says, you can keep deja vu, laugh out loud. Warren Chamberlain says, maybe they should take Mitch McConnell's advice and get out of politics. Really get out of politics, like make no contributions to any politicians. That's what the big businesses should do. They should go on strike for 6 months, see how Mitch McConnell likes it, see how Joe Biden likes it. Dia says, even Rachel Madcow was laughing at McConnell. That was the height of hypocrisy. Warren Chamberlain is glad I stopped by. And Warren says, Taiwan has 300 kilometer per hour high-speed trains. Yes, they have a very prosperous economy there. And Evelina Pont says, Formosa is Old Spanish for Hermosa, which means beautiful. Yes, but what does Formosa mean in Japanese? Because it was the Japanese calling the place Formosa. Evelyn says, Taiwan is tiny. What do they need high-speed trains for? Well, it's big enough for them to need high-speed trains. There are 24 million people living in that tiny place, Evelina. It's populous. Kay says, Nina was interviewed in the Majority Report today. Great interview. I shared a while ago. I hope she wins. We need her badly. We do need her. We do need her. She's a fighter. I think she's going to keep on fighting. Warren Chamberlain says, I see what you mean about the leakage. Yeah, demand leakage. It's constantly a problem. Susan Elder says, need to log off. Good night, all. Good night, Susan. Thank you for coming. And Dia Swift says, awesome show tonight. Thank you, Dia. Well, I've come to the end. And so it's about my time to pack it in for tonight. I will be back but tomorrow night. Hope to see you all here. And a number of others too. And Lana says, remember when we had a request chant, quote, I want my MTV, unquote. Now I want to chant, quote, I want my high-speed rail. Yeah, I'd love to have high-speed rail too. I think we'd all love to have high-speed rail so we could get places real quick. It'd be great to be able to get from Washington to New York in an hour or an hour and a half. That would be wonderful. Kay says, thank you all for another great discussion. Love you all. We love you, Kay. We really do. Evelina says, good night, all, and thank you. And thank you all, friends. And good night, Lana.